Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Monday at Tsene with Wellifehub Inc. My name is Matthew Steele, and I'm a clinical psychologist. Today, I will be speaking to you about male suicide. Male suicide and suicide in general is a public health crisis across the globe. We have 2 times as many deaths by suicide than we do by homicide. For every suicide, about 7 to 10 people are directly affected by the loss. So it's a very big issue that affects the lives of many people. Mental health and addiction are one of the most important risk factors when thinking and talking about male suicide and suicide in general. Now, looking more locally, South Africa ranks as number 10 or the top 10 in the world for the most amount of suicides committed. So that equates to about 23.5 suicides per 100,000 people. Of the just under 14,000 suicides that are reported, about just under 11,000 are committed by men. That means that men are up to 5 times more likely than women are to commit suicide, and they account for about 80% of the suicides globally. I think an important point to keep in mind when having this conversation is that the biggest threat to a man's life is his own hands. So what are some of the factors that lead us down this path of male suicide? One of the factors that's important is the lethal methods that men tend to use when committing suicide. These often amount to very violent and aggressive ways to try and kill themselves, whether that be by gun or knife or hanging themselves. I think an equally important point to make is that even when men use the same methods as women do to commit suicide, they are still more likely to die by that suicide attempt. And this speaks to the fact that it's not only the method that affects this, but it's also other factors such as addiction and substance abuse, but also the loneliness and isolation that men are faced with in their daily lives. It means they're less likely to receive the same help that otherwise would be available to them. One of the other big factors in male suicide is the stigma associated with male mental health and the role that men play in society at large. One of the stigmas is that men need to be strong, that they need to bear the load, grit their teeth, and just get through the challenges that they are faced with in their life. And I think that this can be a really dangerous and damaging stigma and narrative to hold in males society, in society. I think one of the other things that is often thought about is that it's almost unmanly or weak to seek help or need help. And that means that men are much less likely to ask for help and actually seek the support that they need. What we find is that men communicate a lot less about their mental health, and up to 40% of men have never spoken to anyone about the mental health challenges that they are faced with in their life. So what are some of the reasons for this? Well, when asking men about why they don't ask for help or seek support, what we hear them say are things like, well, I've learned to deal with it. I've learned to cope with it and get through it. Another thing is that they don't want to be a burden on other people, and they might even be embarrassed or ashamed to ask for help. One other thing that men say is that there's a negative stigma associated with men and mental health challenges, which I think speaks exactly to the part of the problem here. So if we're looking at the big risk factors about male suicide, that falls into 3 general categories. We've got occupational challenges, interpersonal challenges, and then childhood trauma. The occupational challenges, this could be something like losing a job, going through a period of unemployment, or even just shifting career choices. Some of the interpersonal challenges that men are faced with, and the big one is divorce, which is a major factor in male suicide. And like I mentioned, childhood trauma plays a role in this as well, as a big risk factor for male suicide. So when looking for the signs and symptoms of someone at risk of suicide, what we find is that men's ways of trying to cope, and unhealthy ways of trying to cope or deal with the mental health challenges that they're faced with, can also be grouped into 3 categories. And broadly speaking, that's withdrawal, escapism, and externalization. So what do I mean when I say these words? Withdrawal tends to mean quite literally actually withdrawing themselves from society, which leads them into a place of being isolated and alone. There's a huge amount of loneliness that men are faced with, as well as then contributing to the fact that they communicate less with others about the problems that they're faced with or the suicidal thoughts that they are sitting with. That means that they don't speak up, they don't seek help, and leads them down that path. One of the other factors is escapism. Now, escapism means they're trying to get away from the overwhelming feelings and the thoughts that they're faced with, the problems, the challenges that they are confronted with. And this often takes the form of addiction and substance use. And whether that be increased alcohol intake, use of drugs, or even medication and pills. The other thing that men tend to do to try and escape from these problems is then engage in risky and reckless behavior. And that can take the form of partying too much, drinking too much, driving too fast, having risky sexual encounters. And I think that's an important factor that we also need to consider in this. There's almost the two extreme ends of this, withdrawing or trying to run away from it. And this often leads to impulsive actions being taken, and this reduced impulse control, this reduced amount of control that they feel in their life. And the last category is externalization. So externalization, this is a tendency that men have when the feelings or the thoughts come up on the inside, that they tend to push them onto the outside. So that often takes the form of something like emotional volatility. Men tend not to show or not to want to show the sadness that they are faced with. So it often takes the form of irritability or anger or rage. And part of the reason for this is because it's difficult for them to cope with what they're feeling on the inside. And it's easier to show that anger, which makes them feel powerful. The other ways that men tend to externalize is then through violent and aggressive acts. And this often has a huge impact on those around them and also reduces the chance that they're actually going to get the help that they need. One of the other forms that externalization can take is of relational abuse. And this speaks once again to that impact that they can have on others when they themselves are not coping. Okay, so now that we've got a better understanding and a better idea of what male mental health looks like, let's talk a little bit about what are the ways that we can help. What role can we take in addressing this big public health issue? So I think an important thing to keep in mind is that you need to speak up. You need to have the conversation with those men that you're worried about. Speak openly and directly about your concerns and your fears, and speak openly and directly about suicide itself. If they're already suicidal, and even if they're not, you're not going to push them to a place where they feel more suicidal. What you're actually going to do is help reduce the risk that they're at, help them feel more connected, which is one of the big things that we need to use to solve this problem, is help with that connection and helping men not feel so lonely and isolated with the challenges they faced. Now, when having this conversation, it's important that we operate from a non-judgmental space. That means that we don't shame, we don't lecture, we don't act surprised and shocked and aghast at what the challenges these men face or the thoughts that they're having. It's important that we listen, and we really listen so that we can understand and connect with them. It's through sharing our vulnerabilities that allows us to connect with others. Something else that we can do is take action. And what that means is do something about it. Have the conversation. Remove the means of suicide from the spaces that they have access to. So whether that be taking away the weapons, the guns, the knives, the ropes, something like that, or even the medication and pills that they might otherwise use. It's important that we stay with them. We don't leave them alone to continue to face these challenges by themselves. Suicide often happens in isolation. So if we can stay there with them, that reduces the risk that they're going to commit suicide. Another important thing to think about is then actually generate a safety plan with them, a plan for them to put into action should they be in crisis. And that means then giving them a list or writing a list with them about friends and family that they could contact in that moment, people that would actually come out and help them. It means giving them the numbers to suicide crisis lines, whether that be through the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, Lifeline, or even the National Suicide Crisis Line. As well as then, in a crisis, actually taking them to the hospital or calling an ambulance to come and help so they can get the assistance that they need and we can keep them alive. The last thing that's important here is giving them access to mental health services. Call in for support. Call in for the professionals to come and help you in these spaces so that they can actually get the help that they are in desperate need of. You know, male issues, male problems are not up to men alone to solve. It's a societal issue that we all need to take seriously and all need to work towards fixing and helping in ways that we can. All of us have a role to play in society here. And let's not forget that. Let's allow ourselves to be brave enough to get the help, but also be the help that people need. Thank you very much for joining for this episode, and I'll see you soon.